Hello and welcome to this video, and it's quite a sad video. I've just woken up to the news that the great organist, trumpeter and also saxophone player and singer Joey DeFrancesco has died at the age of 51. I don't know what he's died of, but it's a pretty young age. This week, as we've seen two other passings in the jazz community that I'd like to mention first before I move on to a little talk about Joey DeFrancesco. The first I would like to mention is the great drummer Freddie Studer. Freddie Studer was born in 1947, died this week, which means he was around about 75, 76 years old. Freddie Studer is an absolutely fantastic drummer, founder member of the 70s fusion band, European fusion band On. I have here this album, which is a sort of compilation of various stuff he's done throughout the 80s, early 90s. He's playing here with a whole bunch of people, including Charlie Mariano, Dom Romeo from the original Weatherport lineup, Trilot Gertu, of course, worked with John McLaughlin on in the trio in the early 90s, Nana Vasconcelos from Pat Metheny's band, Miroslav Vitous, a whole host of players. This is a really fantastic album that really showcased what a fantastic drummer Freddie Studer was. And Freddie was one of those drummers that was really wide-ranging. He could move all the way from free jazz to improvised to avant-garde, all the way through to jazz fusion, all the way across. And he seemed to have an interest in all that stuff. Really interesting player. He's cropped up on my channel before on a video of albums that have blew my mind. That's what the title's called, something like that anyway. But I'm very pleased to be able to mention this album again. If no one's heard it, it's this album, Red Twist Tuned Arrow by Fredy and also Christy Duran and Stefan Wittweder, right? This is a mind-blowing album. Drums and two guitars, and it straddles fusion, avant-garde, classical, avant-garde jazz, minimalism, a whole host of stuff, and it doesn't sound like any of those things. So it's really sad to hear Freddie's gone. He was really well respected in the drum community, if not so much in the wider realm. He didn't get mentioned that much, but I was always aware of him as an incredible drummer. He was linked to Paiste Cymbals, did a lot of clinics with them. So Freddie, really sad. The other titan of jazz really was Creed Taylor, who has died at the age of 94 years old. So Creed Taylor was a producer. He worked for Verve in the 50s and 60s. I'm not going to list the people he produced, it just goes on and on and on. But with Verve, he was responsible for really signing and promoting the bossa nova artists like Antonio Carlos Jobim, which completely changed the face of jazz history. He signed Wes Montgomery, produced a lot of Wes Montgomery's albums. There's a whole host of people. He signed John Coltrane to Impulse Records. He was only with Impulse a short time. In 1967 he formed a label called CTI Records, which had incredibly high production values. It was almost like a 70s version of GRP. It could be prone a little bit to middle of the road stuff, and it got famous for that type of style. But it also did all sorts of different albums. For example, Velvet Darkness by Alan Holmes was produced by Creed Taylor on CTI. I pulled out this album. That's the one I want to represent the passing of Creed Taylor, which is the Joe Farrell Quartet that came out in 1970, featuring Chick Corea, Jack DeJohnette, Dave Holland, and on two tracks John McLaughlin, including an incredible version, in fact my favourite version of Follow Your Heart. There is some out and out free jazz playing on here. If you're a McLaughlin fan, then the track Motion is possibly his deepest foray into free jazz that you will ever hear. So for as much as Creed Taylor did produce a lot of the more middle of the road stuff with people like George Benson, Joe Beck and all that type of stuff, he also was behind Coltrane getting signed and albums like this. So yeah, Creed Taylor, 94 years old, changed the face of jazz. Now let's move on to Joey DeFrancesco. Joey DeFrancesco was perhaps the greatest exponent, modern exponent of the Hammond organ. He was an absolute child prodigy, starting to play at the age of 4, and by the age of 5 he could play tracks by Jimmy Smith. A really incredible musician. He comes from a musical family. His dad, Joseph DeFrancesco, is an organist as well. He's still going. He's 80 years old, 81 years old. His brother's a blues guitarist as well. So he's come from a musical family. He showed incredible promise at an early age. And he was pretty much working professionally by the age of 10, 11, and was signed by the age of 16. Not only was he signed at the age of 16, then when he was out gigging at that age, he was spotted by Miles Davis, and he actually played keyboards on a mandolin by Miles Davis. This guy, as soon as he emerged, blew everybody away, and it was a greater achievement because if you consider the history of jazz organ playing, there is a very noble history, right? And this goes back to the organ trios of the 1960s, which would be Jimmy Steve, Jack McDuff, all those types of guys, right? It's quite an interesting sort of classic unit for jazz because it's organ, guitar usually, and drums. No bass player. Now the Hammond organ was actually a sort of home entertainment product. It was something that was created for people to play in their homes. It would try and emulate pre-synthesis, different sounds, using organ technology, wind technology. That's what the Hammond organ is. So this is a really, really new instrument. Of course, jazz, the brilliance of jazz being what it is anything new it can accommodate. And so the organ then gets accommodated into jazz. And by the 1960s, it becomes a staple of jazz. Jazz really turns the Hammond organ into a proper instrument. I can't think of any classical musicians that use it. I'm sure there are examples. But it basically took a sort of novelty home instrument and turned it into an instrument that could create great art. The great virtuoso of the Hammond organ was Jimmy Smith. Towards the mid to late 60s, Larry Young emerges. And Larry Young has taken on Coltrane's approach to music and Miles Davis's approach to music, the more modernist approach. And he has put that onto the organ. He's exploring much more chordal harmony and stuff like this. For viewers of this channel, of course, John McLaughlin, who had played in a number of British organ trios, off the top of my head, and I haven't researched this, people like, of course, Graham Bond and Mike Carr, I think. So John McLaughlin had come up through this organ trio tradition. He, with Tony Williams and Larry Young, decides to form one of the early fusion bands. Now, Tony Williams' lifetime is far more interesting than just being an early fusion band because it's taking that relatively new classic jazz ensemble structure of the organ trio. There's only been around about 10 years, but it's established and it's morphing it into something new, right? They're not taking the classic jazz quintet, double bass, drums, piano, two horns. They're not taking that and trying to make fusion out of that. It's as though they're going, well, what unit can we make fusion out? Well, actually, if you look at this jazz unit, this is actually quite modern because it's got electric guitar and it's got electric organ in. It's electrified already. Let's push that into a fusion area. It's really interesting. Larry Young is an absolute genius of this. But of course, through musicians like Jan Hammer and then later on Chick Corea, Herbie Hancock and Joe Zawinul, the synthesizer becomes so important. And by the end of the 70s, the organ has pretty much dropped out of jazz. It's gone. Joey DeFrancesco is the guy that almost single-handedly brings the organ back into jazz. All right, he brings that sound back into jazz in the 80s and the 90s. This opens the door for people like Medeski, Martin and Wood. It also opens the door for the sound you hear on albums like Ill Communication by the Beastie Boys. He brings the organ back, and he does this by being a virtuoso organist, which is different to being a virtuoso synthesizer player or a piano player. Part part of the reason for that is because if you're playing in an organ trio, you have to call the bass end and the treble end at the same time. If you listen to Joey DeFrancesco, it's actually quite astonishing what is going on with the walking bass lines while he's soloing at the same time. John McLaughlin discovered him. Well, I wouldn't say discovered him because he was already well known, but he goes back to the organ trio. It's almost like he met Joey DeFrancesco and goes, right, I'm going back to the organ trio. It was interesting because at that time John McLaughlin was not playing electric guitar, so it was also a return to electric guitar. And he makes this album, right, which I'll just pull out the insert. He made this album, Free Spirits, right. And if I just open it up, you can see, let's see the guy there. There's Dennis Chambers and there's Joey there on there, right. So this was like almost like John McLaughlin's return to electric music. It was a return to the electric trio. It was a return to working with a drummer, really, because before that he was working with Trilok Gertu, who I know operates pretty much like a drummer, but Dennis Chambers was such a high-power drummer. This album is an incredible album, and if you're a McLaughlin fan and you want to check out Joey DeFrancesco, that's the album to go for. After that, they did an album with Elvin Jones. So Elvin Jones, John McLaughlin, Joey DeFrancesco, which I've been trying to find in my vaults this morning and I can't find, which is a really incredible album and a really interesting album for John McLaughlin because he really goes deep into sort of Coltrane and also jazz standard territory on that album. It's one that's really loved by more pure jazz guitar lovers. John McLaughlin goes much closer to having sort of clean tone, Wes Montgomery sound. Joey DeFrancesco is an interesting musician for me because he's actually, he was younger than me. He was born 3 years younger than me in 1971. He's had an incredible career in that time. So he's made 30 solo albums. He's played with absolutely everybody, not just jazz artists, but mainstream artists as well, pop artists. He's even appeared in films. He's had quite an impingement on culture as well as just being a musician. He's lived 2 or 3 lifetimes in that span. He's done so much, but it's really interesting hearing about Creed Taylor, a music producer, dying comfortably at the age of 94 years old, and then hearing of Joey DeFrancesco dying at 51 years old. And we sort of go, oh yeah, Joey DeFrancesco's died. He's 51 years old. He's 4 years older than me. We don't know what he's died of, but it's an awful thing that so many jazz musicians seem to die too young. It's evidence that this art form is still not valued. If you look at classical musicians, they're almost famous for living on to 90, 100 years old. You don't hear of the early deaths in classical music, but in jazz, it's almost like a 50% chance if you're a jazz musician that you're not going to make it. You're really not going to make it, and that's a sad thing. Why that is, I don't know. I think the life's hard. It's not a healthy lifestyle, perhaps. I think there is a support, so people are financially, even artists that are sort of legendary artists can have difficulty supporting themselves. It's just really sad. I'm really shocked and upset. I saw the organ trio, John McLaughlin's organ trio in '94. And it was incredible. I can remember watching it, and there was at one point where I felt like I was floating out the chair. They were playing so intensely. Dennis Chambers was off the chart. John McLaughlin was just burning. But equally burning was Joey DeFrancesco. He was incredible for John McLaughlin, because obviously McLaughlin's so fast and fluid. But so is Joey DeFrancesco. He was all over the place on that gig. But at one point, he pulled a trumpet out and he did a trumpet solo that was so beautiful and poignant. The guy was a real genius. It only seems the other day I was watching that gig
I was young and he was even younger. You know, he how old would he have been on that gig if he was born in 1971? So 71, 81, 91. So he was like 23 when I saw him, 23 years old. And now the guy's dead. It just seems absolutely bizarre. Really, really bizarre. We've got to keep talking about the music. We've got to keep celebrating it. We've got to value it. You know, this is not commercial music. It's not supported by a system outside. The musicians need to be looked after. We're living in a culture at the moment where musicians are being looked after less and less. They're not valued at all. And that is going on within education, going on in the way culture works, the support for concerts and gigs. All of that is scratching away at musicians' livelihoods whose only intention is to try and make beautiful things. It's a terrible situation. Anyway, that has been my tribute to the incredible Freddie Studer, the incredible Creed Taylor, and the incredible Joey DeFrancesco. May they all be in a better place now, hopefully. What more can I say? I'll see you in the next video. Thanks a lot.